Welcome back, everybody, to Ravenstar's Witching Hour. I'm your host, Solaris BlueRaven, and I'm here with my very special guest, Robert Guffey. Robert, you with me?
Yes.
All right. It's a pleasure to have you on tonight. And I do want to applaud you for telling Damien's story. I think that is so significant that you actually created a time capsule on his behalf. So thank you for doing this.
It was very difficult to publish the book. Usually when I've published, short stories, articles, all sorts of things since I was about 24. And when you submit an article or a story or a book manuscript anywhere, you generally always get a response. Even if it's just a form letter, a polite no, you usually get a response. Maybe you get it 6 months later, or you might get it 9 months later, but eventually you get a response. With this particular book, sometimes I would never even get a response. It's as if they had never seen it, and then when I did get a response, often the response from their larger publishers was sort of stunned puzzlement. I think they thought it was a joke. I'm not sure what they thought, but fortunately, John Oakes, who's the head of Or Books in New York, he immediately keyed in on it and understood exactly what I was doing. So he seemed to appreciate the fact that it was a strange book, but that it was also an important book. And as far as I know, the first book about gang stalking that was not the first professionally published book about gang stalking, let's put it that way.
There are different books out there, but yours is very different, and it's just the way it's been mapped out insofar as the case itself. But yeah, there are books out there, I will tell you that much, and I have one out, and I know there are several others. But it's real interesting because the window he was hit, that was like you said, 2004?
Yeah, it started for him in July of 2003.
Yeah, see, mine was in April of 2004. So
it's interesting. It seems like a lot of this mushroomed right after 9/11. I mean, it was happening before, like the case I mentioned earlier about the guy who stole the tank and all that, who was experiencing. By the way, that happened in the exact same neighborhood where Damien lived. The documentary is called Cul-de-sac, and it was directed by a man named Garrett Scott, who died mysteriously soon afterward at a very young age. And if you watch that documentary Cul-de-sac, you'll see that the filmmakers themselves are not aware of the film that they're making. They think they're making a film about the class struggle in San Diego and about this drug addict who's going crazy. But when you watch it and you know all this other stuff, you see that what they're describing is a gang stalking scenario.
Right.
So I recommend watching that for that reason.
Oh, absolutely.
And that, like I say, that happened in the 90s, and then with the case with Phil Dick and everything that Tessa Dick told me about what they went through, that was in the 70s. And then I also mentioned that I knew I was friends with Walter Boart, and in his book Operation Mind Control, talk about similar stuff that goes all the way back to World War II.
Right.
The incident that I was talking about right before the break was. You mentioned, have I been sort of a neutral energy in all this? And there have been strange incidents that I think tie in with their kind of weird obsession with these goggles. And the one incident that stands out in my mind is that it was about 2005. Damien was briefly staying at my apartment in Long Beach, and right before he left to go back to where he was staying, he said, beware of like new people who suddenly enter your life or start asking you weird questions out of the blue. Just be cautious. And I thought maybe he was being overly cautious. But literally the next day, a friend of mine was coming in from New York, and I was supposed to meet her, and we were going to go out to have lunch. She was riding the bus over to meet me. She calls me on her cell phone and says that this guy starts talking to her on the bus, and he wanted to take both of us out to lunch, which I could understand why he might want to take her out to lunch because she was attractive, but I don't know why he would want to take me and her out to lunch. But this guy, I said, oh, okay, she's a friendly sort of sociable person, so I was like, okay, whatever. So this guy shows up with my friend, and he introduces himself. He says he's a longshoreman who works down at the port in Long Beach and shakes my hand. His hands are like baby soft. He has like a manicure. And he's telling me he's a longshoreman. This longshoreman offers to buy me and my friend lunch at this extremely expensive restaurant in downtown Long Beach. He claims he has a friend who works there and can get us a meal for free. It's all sounding really odd, but I relent to this, and we go there. At one point, my friend goes off to make a phone call and leaves me alone with this guy I've never met before. And he starts out of the blue, starts telling me, he's like, "Are you into conspiracy theories? Have you ever read a book called Behold a Pale Horse by Milton Cooper?" Now, of course, I read Behold a Pale Horse. It's, this classic book in, conspiracy research, right? Mm-hmm. And anyone who I know who has read the book usually refers to him as Bill Cooper or William Cooper. But he kept calling him Milton Cooper because that's what it says on the cover. Milton William Cooper. So you never heard of Milton Cooper, what do you think about it? It's like calling, Babe Ruth by his first name, like calling him George Ruth as opposed to Babe Ruth, It's as if he had just picked up the book like the previous day, and he was claiming that, he was a fan of this book. He's throwing these like kind of talking points out at me, trying to connect with me on some level. And at one point he throws out, he goes, "What do you think about this country? What about George Bush?" At this point, George W. Bush was president. "What do you think about George W. Bush? Don't you think we need a revolution in this country? Don't you think? Where is Lee Harvey Oswald when you need him?" He's just throwing out all these comments to see what I'm going to say, Instead, I'm just batting them all away, I love George W. Bush, it's fantastic. I think this country is on a fantastic route, it just needs to keep going, full steam ahead. And he just seemed discombobulated. I just kept saying things that were opposite to whatever the, script that they had given him. It was a very peculiar incident. It was as if he wanted to bond with me over conspiracies, and then I was supposed to say something about these goggles,
Mm-hmm.
or I was supposed to say something about Damien,
Right.
And things like that have occasionally occurred, but nothing like what Damien's experienced. I don't think I've ever been targeted to that degree. But then again, maybe that makes sense because the whole point of targeting someone is to isolate them. So if you target someone else and their friend, obviously they're going to bond over the targeting, and now they're not isolated anymore,
Right.
So it makes sense that if you pick someone to target, you kind of have to just target them and not any of their friends or their family.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I don't know. Have you ever heard of someone who it sort of spreads out and affects the people who are attempting to help him or her?
No, I've heard of people sometimes they get psychotronically attacked or investigated if they get some kind of a correlation of documentation going, but usually that doesn't happen. Usually these people are singled out. And it goes from anybody, from professionals to whoever. It's not just these people who are destitute or into drugs or anything. I mean, they just pick people. But it sounds like your friend got into a situation where he was, I kind of wonder what happened to that guy. I mean, he just kind of vanished off the radar, that Lee character.
I would love to know more about that. I was being interviewed on a radio show out of Minnesota, and everything's kind of blurring together. It was called Darkness Radio.
Okay.
And the host asked me about that, and he said, "How come you didn't ever try to find out who this like Lee Doyle guy was?" Well, I tried to find out, and then he said, "Well, how many people went AWOL in July of went AWOL from Camp Pendleton in July of 2003? Well, they don't just give you that information. I mean, they're not just to tell me that information. And also, I don't know his name. That's a big barrier to finding anything out. He said his name was Lee. They said it was Doyle. I don't have a last name. I don't know what happened to him. And apparently, whatever did happen to him, he didn't give them the goggles back because they were still looking for it, Mm-hmm. There was a weird incident where after I had been out of touch with Damien for a while, I emailed him to tell him that I had just found some of his writing in my storage space, which was, the storage space was off-site. It was not in the apartment building where I was living. But from the email, from the way I wrote it, you might think that I was referring to the storage area that's in my apartment building.
Mm-hmm.
And I was supposed to go out of town with my wife up north, but at the last minute I decided to stay behind to get some writing done. So I spent all day inside on the Saturday writing, and the previous day I had sent this email to Damien basically saying, hey, I found your stuff. I didn't use the word stuff. I found your stuff in my storage space. It's safe there now. What do you want me to do with it? Do you want me to send it to you now? And he wrote back. He goes, just keep it there for now. After that brief exchange, the next day, my wife leaves town. I stay behind. I'm indoors. I'm writing all day. Later that night, about 2 a.m., I go into the bedroom, which was on the second story and faced the alleyway. When I turned on the light from the bedroom kind of flooded the alley, and I hear all this scurrying downstairs. This kind of panicked scurrying, and people running off down the alleyway. And I just thought, I didn't really think anything of it. I just turned the light out and went to sleep. Well, the next morning I woke up probably around 9 a.m. or something. And about an hour later, I left to go to the post office, and I run into my downstairs neighbor, this motorcycle enthusiast who had all this electronic stuff stored in the garage underneath. And he said, did you see the garage? And I go, no, well, what about it? And he leads me in there, and the whole place is just completely torn apart. All of his electronic equipment has been strewn about on the floor, and I had 2 bikes in there. They were completely untouched. He had some motorcycles that were untouched. I mean, the stuff was like right by the door. All you had to do was just roll it out. If it was just thieves going in to grab something to go pawn it or whatever,
right.
But none of that stuff had been taken, and Then at that point, I thought back to the email, which I said that I had his stuff, in my storage space,
right.
and I don't know, it could be it was just his whole coincidence, and it was just, mad junkies broke in to get some money, but so. Yeah, so weird things that happen like that. I have a friend who's an entertainment lawyer who I gave the original manuscript to read, and she was at a restaurant in Santa Monica reading it over Labor Day weekend, and she had taken the manuscript and a notebook of hers and went to her car and put it in the back seat, and then she drove down to the beach in Santa Monica to walk her dogs. So she locked the doors, and the manuscript was in the back seat with her notes. And so she takes the dogs on a walk on the beach. That takes about 20 minutes or something. And she comes back to the car, and the manuscript's gone, and her notebook's gone. And she even went back, and there's no evidence that the car had been broken into. And she even drove back to the restaurant to see if she'd left it there, even though she knew she hadn't. She's a lawyer, she understands documents. Documents are important,
Right.
But just to check, she went back to the restaurant and no, it was not there. So again, weird things like that have happened, but nothing on the level of what Damien has experienced.
Mm-hmm. Well, count your blessings on that one. It still sounds like you might be monitored, though. I mean, with phone or internet, and that's kind of suspicious. What happened to the lawyer friend of yours? So.
Yes, it's certainly, and oddly enough, the friend I'm referring to, she's been involved in this since she was a child. Her father was a powerful judge up in Washington State. She grew up as a child in the 60s, and she remembers she was a victim of ritual abuse, and also she remembers being trained, given military training when she was a child. There's bits of lost memory there, lost time, and she very much believes that she was a mind control subject as a child, due to her father.
Right. Well, it's highly possible, and that is there are quite a few people, let's put it that way, that are out there that have been programmed and have altars and have been through ritual abuse. And yeah, you'd be surprised on how many numbers there are insofar as how many people have been affected by that.
In her particular case, it's interesting because she claims that she was ritually abused in a Masonic lodge somewhere up in Washington, and her story's never changed. I don't disbelieve her story in any way. I've mentioned before that Richard Schoengert's a Mason. He's a 33rd degree Freemason. I'm a 32nd degree Freemason. At one point when I was on Coast to Coast, right near the end of the show, George Knapp asked the question. He said, I wanted to ask the question if you being a Freemason has in any way gotten in the way of you telling this story. But that was like the last, then the show ended, so I was not able to answer that question. I kind of wish he'd asked me earlier, because I noticed that some people are like skeptical about it. Like, what's this Freemason doing talking about this? There's some skepticism there, which is interesting because from my perspective, Freemasonry is not about, I've never had any experience, I've never seen anything on the level of the corruption that my friend has described. I don't doubt her story, but I've never seen anything like that. But there's apart from there's a book called The Book of the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, written in 1884 by Charles T. McClenahan. And this is, I just want to read you a brief paragraph from the 21st degree. And it reads, this is part of the oath that you were supposed to take, the long-form oath of the Scottish Rite. This is published material, so I'm not giving away any secrets or something. It says, whosoever has been wronged by the great or oppressed by the powerful, whosoever has been unjustly accused or his household outraged, whosoever has fallen into the hands of corrupt judges, whosoever has suffered by bribery or extortion, let him come freely forward and prefer his complaint, and right shall be done him by the Grand Chapter of Prussian Knights, from whose judgment there is no appeal, coming from the north and the south, the east and the west, to hear the complaints of the oppressed, judge the guilty, and teach men how to be free. As Knight and Mason, it is our bound duty to shield and protect the innocent, as it is to assist the distressed. So,
Nice.
Those sound pretty good to me. And if you take that literally, then you could do nothing else but to speak out about something like this.
I agree. It's interesting, and just to interject for a second here, my grandfather was high up in the high-ranking Scottish Rite Masons also, and yeah, from my perspective, I've come from that background of good people and good Masons, and I never had any weirdness. So, what happened to me had nothing to do with them, unless they tried to target my ancestors, through me. But
right.
Yeah.
Briefly, I wanted to mention that speaking of the Masons, Richard Schoengert and I, if anyone who's listening to this is in Southern California, Richard Schoengert and I will be speaking about Chameleo at the De Molay Masonic Center in Anaheim at 303 West Lincoln Avenue in Anaheim on Tuesday, February 23rd from 6 to 9 p.m. And it's an open event. You don't have to be a Mason to come, and it's free. And it's going to be entirely about Chameleo, and Richard Schoengert will be going into his experiences speaking at military conferences, which he's done with his partner, Lev Berger, where he had this amazing experience in Charleston at a military conference back in 2005, where he pitched his Project Chameleo to a whole audience of these military people. And a woman stood up during the middle of his presentation and said, how dare you reveal top secret information here? And Richard said, this is like during the middle of his presentation, he's up on the podium, and he said, this isn't top secret information. This is my project, my personal project. And she said, no, this is top secret information. I happen to know that. And then she said, well, finish the presentation and then we'll talk about this afterwards. So Richard continued the presentation about how you could use this technology on the battlefield. And afterwards, this woman came up with these, jarhead-looking guys, and then dragged him into a separate room to debrief him. Where did you learn about this information? And he said, I didn't have to learn about it anywhere. I made it up because it's my invention, and so I'm just telling you what I invented. And then he had to take her out to the car to show her that he had the proper credentials to be there. And finally, he convinced her. Someone else came into the room, kind of like whispered in her ear, and then she was like, "Oh, okay, you can go." So clearly, from that experience, he's here pitching this concept that someone else was already pursuing. You see, right. And that was in 2005, and we spoke to Richard in 2006. And he told me in 2006 that he was approached by SAIC and the Navy 10 years earlier, so that would have made it 1996. So, from 1996 to 2005, they had clearly already pursued this.
Right. Can I ask you a quick question? So regarding the invisibility cloaking system, in theory, so would it mean that there were real people inside that place of your friends?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So they were actually real people in there that were actually cloaked.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I think that, and Richard thinks this too, that what they did was, in this particular instance, they needed to experiment with this stuff because obviously you need to experiment with it before you used it in a battlefield situation. You want to know before you deploy this in a situation where American soldiers are potentially going to get shot, you want to know, is this stuff working properly? Mm-hmm. So I had a friend at the time who said to me, she was kind of skeptical about all this. She said, why wouldn't they just test it on the base? Why wouldn't they just test it on Camp Pendleton? Because my answer to that is because you want to test it in a situation that's not entirely controlled, so that you can see where the technology breaks down. When does the person notice that there's someone there who's supposed to be camouflaged or cloaked, but obviously is not fully 100% camouflaged or cloaked because he saw them in the mirror, or because he saw the technology break down and saw those auras in the air? Mm-hmm. So whenever you want to note, okay, he saw us then, we need to fix that. And I think that two things kind of converged at once. Damien refused to go along with what they wanted him to do. That pissed them off. It pissed them off that he was a drug addict, based on what I mentioned Lita saying in the bagel shop, and it pissed them off that he was just being so difficult and not respecting them, Mm-hmm. And so they figured, why not use him as a guinea pig? Perfect. He's a drug addict. If he talks about it, no one will believe him. But that's the wonderful thing about synchronicity. There's no way that you could predict that this guy is going to have a friend who's a college professor, B, a Freemason, C, a writer who's friends with Walter Board, who wrote the book on Operation Mind Control back in 1978. And so I was already primed to accept this because I was already aware of the mind control stuff, Mm-hmm. And then that I would be in the same lodge with the guy from whom they stole the technology in the first place. That's just like blow your mind incredible.
Wow, that is such synchronicity. And, I don't believe in coincidence. I mean, how can that possibly be anything but it's beyond fate to some degree?
Oh, absolutely. And it shows you it's one of the things they can't control. Synchronicity is just something that is beyond their control.
It's almost like the divine intervention comes in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is interesting. There's no doubt about that. I think you might be right about those goggles, though, that what you're theorizing, your theory is, I think it could be something like that where you could put them on and see beyond the technology that they're using for cloaking.
It seems to make sense. It could be that I'm connecting two disparate, events that just happen to be coinciding at the same time. But it makes sense to me. You would, if you, whenever you invent a disease, you want to invent the cure, right? Mm-hmm. So if you've got cloaking technology, you want to have stuff that's going to counteract it in case someone else gets it. Right,
exactly.
So it makes sense that you would invent both things at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And didn't you mention? I believe it might have been on George Knapp's show, but you were mentioning the saucer wreckage or something that with Colonel Corso. Was it you or was it George Knapp that mentioned that?
What George Knapp was mentioning was the fact that what was blowing his mind was that during the conversation with Richard, it's, like I didn't know what direction this was going to go in. I didn't know if Richard was going to say, well, this is kind of crazy, I'm leaving, but instead he kind of goes two steps beyond and starts mentioning that he's really into UFOs and that he's always been interested in UFOs, and starts talking about, starts quoting Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, and then starts mentioning the fact that, he's always believed that the cinema, Hollywood, purposely puts out secret information in the form of fiction in order to, A, to cover it up, and B, to reveal it at the same time. The disclosure is the cover-up, and the cover-up is the disclosure, as Phil Corso said in The Day After Roswell. And Schoellengert referenced the Predator film from the 80s along those lines. Predator, the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, where the alien has the cloaking camouflage technology out in the jungle. And Richard said that's pretty much what it looks like. If you go watch that movie, that's what it looks like. And so Richard was quoting Corso and mentioning that, and brought up the whole UFO angle, and that was kind of blowing George Knapp's mind. The fact that I'm talking to this guy, and not only does he confirm all the invisibility stuff, but then it starts going off into these other realms as well. And in fact, I just did another interview with Richard. I went to his house and sat there. He just recently retired. He's 85.
Wow.
And just recently retired. And so I thought I should sit down with him and just interview him about the connection between Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and his interest in science. And so I talked to him for about 2.5 hours just on that subject, how his interest in UFOs, mysticism, Rosicrucianism, esotericism, Hermeticism, how that related to his invention of this technology. And it was very interesting because he mentioned how he was initiated into Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism in the same year, I think 55, on the island of Guam. And from that day forward, he was always very much interested in metaphysics, but was also very interested in the hard sciences. And so in the Rosicrucian order, they actually teach or suggest that there is actually a way to make yourself invisible through your own will, through your own willpower, where you're actually sort of, I guess you could say, hypnotizing someone into not seeing you. Right. And Richard said, I'd never met anyone who could actually do that, but the rumor was that there were these masters who could do this. And so from that, and then combined with his interest in UFOs, where people often claim to see UFOs that will disappear suddenly, as if they have some sort of cloaking device. So those two things kind of converged, and Richard, at some point in the early 80s, just started thinking, well, how could you do that technologically? This thing that's considered to be kind of a way out mystical thing that only ascended masters could do. How could you replicate that through technology? And that's what led him into doing it. So he's an interesting person in the sense that he's kind of this nexus point between mysticism and hard science, and often we think of those two things as being separate. But in the days of Paracelsus, he was an alchemist and he was also a scientist. So Richard's kind of a retrieval of that kind of scientist archetype like Paracelsus.
Right. So when you interviewed him, are you planning on writing a book with him?
This particular interview, I'm probably going to be publishing soon. I'm shopping it around at the moment. There's an editor who's interested in it, but I haven't gotten it confirmed yet, so I won't mention anything about it yet. But I suspect it'll probably be published, fairly soon. It's a rather lengthy article. It's almost 10,000 words, so I'm hoping to do it in 2 parts or something like that.
That sounds fascinating. Well, I totally resonate with the cloaking and the frequencies because to me, it's intent and consciousness and frequency that alters the vibration, which would create a cloaking to some degree on an esoteric level. So I find science and mysticism, that's my area too. And I find they all really kind of interconnect on so many different levels, but it's quite fascinating. What wasn't go ahead.
I was just, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, you're the guest. Go ahead.
Put a bookmark there for a second. I was just wondering if I've only met one other person who's a targeted individual who has also witnessed the invisibility aspect of it. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a common theme. The lawyer I mentioned, the guy from Minnesota, that's one of the reasons why he came to see me, was because he said that he experienced that as well. And when he heard me being interviewed, I can't remember which show he heard, he just immediately like, wow, I thought I was going crazy. And he said that he saw that same sort of aura-like phenomenon in his house and in his basement. And he even saw the hologram stuff. They would project police officers standing outside on his deck, things like that. And so I was going to ask you, have you heard anyone else report that type of thing, the invisibility thing? People actually physically in your house, pushing you over and interacting with you in that way?
Well, in my case, it was very different because it was artificial telepathy and it was interconnection, live feed, real time with a handler, and also other driving systems that were used. We used remote viewing and things like that. But I will say there was a lot of exotic technology interfaced with me because people saw this some kind of a screen over me, like an energetic thing. I used to have like a really bright aura, and what they were seeing was this dark green, just an ominous kind of energetic grid over me. People who knew me for years. So I did know they were using exotic technology on me. And I will say that people have come to me in the past that have had strange experiences where, like what you're describing, like a person or a spirit or a ghost. And I don't think it's a ghost. I think it's a manufactured ghost, like what you're talking about. The more I look into this, I think you're right. It's probably the cloaking system that they're using with operators. But one thing I have to look at is how they get into the house. How did they gain access to the house inside? And that's something that when your friend was in jail, how long was he in jail? Because that would have given them an opportunity to maybe set his house up or set his environment up. How were they able to get in and out physically?
I think that's what happened. He was in jail for about a week, and there was one point where he in the apartment building that he was in, there was a shared attic space that ran across the entire building, and there was one point where he was wondering, like, where are they doing all this from? So he got curious and he actually went up through the crawl space up into the attic. And when he went in, it was all dark, up there and very small. You kind of had to crouch down to be in there. But he was in the attic and he heard like the sound of like an immense, like a tiger, something like that, just come rushing at him. The sound. Imagine that, the sound of this tiger like rushing at you in this attic space, and it seemed very real. He booked it out of there and never went back up there. I don't know why they could create like auditory hallucinations as well.
Right. Well, they can also use psychotronic driving systems, which are satellite driven. So yes, they can have the physical plants like you were talking about with the cloaking system. And then what they did, and they've done this with me, is psychotronic driving systems where you're interfaced with, what they'll do is hijack your natural telepathic centers and psychic centers and interface their own projection system. It's just like a movie screen where you're getting imagery that's not coming from you or your psyche, but actually coming from the AI, the artificial intelligence program. It's a complicated system, but I know the developer of the technology, and one of them is Dr. Robert Duncan, who's put out Project Soulcatcher. I think I might have mentioned that off air. And that's a great resource manual for information pertaining to psychotronic warfare. So this has been around for a long time, but I think they might have used that with him as well as the other things, the exotic technology with that cloaking system you're talking about.
That would explain the alien vistas he saw outside his window.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. These guys, I mean, it's amazing what they can do with the technology. It really is. And I think you're right. I think they need some kind of an area where they can test this before they go live, so to speak, in the illusion of.
It's very interesting that Well, I went. Me and a friend of mine actually went down to San Diego to take some photographs of the area where all this happened, and we drove down to where SAIC used to be.
Mm-hmm.
It has since moved, and in fact has split into two different corporations. One of which kept the name SAIC, and the other calls itself Leidos, Leidos. But so they're no longer headquartered in San Diego. But when we did do this was about 2008, I think. They were still there, and I noticed that their headquarters was right across the street from the infamous Whaley House in Old Town San Diego. The Whaley House is infamous for being supposedly one of the most haunted houses in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
It's an old house that dates back to the 1800s, and people were hanged there. It was a courthouse,
right.
And there have been a lot of like ghost shows and documentaries that have gone and filmed there and seen strange things. And I just thought it was interesting that SAIC's headquarters is right across the street.
Yeah, really.
Not that they would have been causing hauntings back in the 1800s, but I just wondered if maybe there was some sort of geophysical reason for building the headquarters there in that spot.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
That's just speculation on my part.
Well, the military stakes power spots. So that's one thing we do know. So whenever there's something where there's some kind of a power spot, they'll stake it. I think they weaponize the technology as far as weaponizing the paranormal is what I'm trying to say. So literally what I've been seeing is them hijacking energy and whatever it is. So if it's paranormal, if it's spirits, ghosts, whatever it is, even the electromagnetic field of a target, they can hijack that and interface it onto their AI and then create a feedback program that's actually creating these programs that hits the target on a certain level of psychological, spiritual warfare. It can be anything, heaven or hell or anything in between. That's my own experience with some of the technology, but I think they do weaponize the paranormal quite a bit. And I'm very leery of people who do ghost hunting and get those little EVPs, because after where I've been with the artificial telepathy, I'm pretty sure that some of that's mock radio communications. It's covert technology communication systems. So they might be thinking they're getting a ghost, but I think a lot of it's actually covert transmission.
Right. Yes, that's interesting. I was fascinated by when I was on with George Knapp. It was just interesting how his book, Hunt for the Skinwalker, which
Mm-hmm.
would be one of these power spots
right.
that you're talking about, the Skinwalker Ranch, that it's the perfect place to experiment with this technology, because you have a spot that's already known for being for having this paranormal phenomenon occurring. So if you start experimenting with this technology, who's going to think anything of it? It's just, it's the old Skinwalker Ranch, right? And there's ghost stories, lingering around that place for 100 years. So it's interesting to think that there could be a mixture of genuine paranormal phenomenon associated with these spots, and then comes these people, doing their experiments on top of it.
Right.
It really muddies the water in terms of paranormal.
Right. Well, it creates an interference pattern. There's no doubt about it. And wasn't that Bigelow that was head of the Skinwalker Ranch investigations, or isn't he involved in that?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Now he's like notorious for what? Government contracts, black technology department. So there you go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you know that there's something afoot with that whole scenario right there. I'd love to get on Skinwalker Ranch, big time, just to check it out. Yeah. Have you been there at all, or have you been able to?
No. That would be fascinating, though. Yeah. Absolutely.
I would be able to debug it in like 2 seconds with covert technology, I bet. It'd be fun. See, now that we know what we're dealing with, there's no boogeyman anymore. That's the part I like. So now we can look at it as covert technology. It's explainable. Everything's explainable, right down to the communication of dialogue.
That's one of the main reasons I wrote the book, and also one of the main reasons I wrote the book in the way I wrote it, because I really thought, I decided to write it as a narrative that a skeptical person could read it and just read it as an entertaining story about these two guys who are driving each other crazy. Mm-hmm. Or you could read it and see it as being an actual true story. But either way, the skeptical guy who reads it and just chooses to think that it's fiction, if that starts happening to him, or if it starts happening to his sister or his daughter or his friend, you're not immediately going to go, oh, that guy's crazy, we need to throw him into a mental asylum. Instead, you'll think, wait a minute, didn't I hear some guy talking about this on the radio? Didn't I read a book about that? Because the main weapon they have is fear, and as H.P. Lovecraft said, the greatest fear is fear of the unknown, and so that's their main tool. Is that a lot of people have no knowledge of any of this stuff, like the lawyer I was talking about, despite the fact that he had multiple degrees and had a law degree from this incredible university. He had no knowledge of any of this sort of esoteric stuff. So he at first thought he was going crazy, voices in his head, and that's what happens to a lot of people. I wonder.
That's the idea.
This lawyer asked me, I wonder how many people, do you know how many people could have possibly committed suicide as a result of this?
I've been doing a lot of research, and I can tell you point blank, besides the targeted individuals, I know one person in general that died in 2008 due to the duress of the program, which was based on artificial telepathy and psychotronic warfare. And they told him they were going to kill him. And within like 3 days, he was dead as forced suicide, what they call a forced suicide. So people do, sometimes they'll kill themselves, or they get into what they call the suicide program. There was the shooter at the Naval Yard, who was hearing voices, quote unquote voices, which he was targeted with psychotronics. I'm pretty sure you remember him. And he was telling people he was being hit with targeted energy, directed energy weapons, and they just said he was crazy. Oh, he's schizophrenic. No, he was a targeted individual who actually broke and snapped. And this is what I mean by mental illness. I mean, sometimes, there's mental illness, and sometimes there's a simulation of mental illness, which is caused by this directed energy weapon. And this is why we expose it, because we've got to get a grip on this technology. It's destroying people. But the military is contracted with artificial telepathy, just so you know that. Their quote unquote clearance boys have access to artificial telepathy.
You're referring to Aaron Alexis,
correct?
Right? Didn't he write ELF?
Yes, he did.
In his weapon, and there was a case not long ago of a guy named Stephen Reichow, 33, who killed a guy named Brandon Moulding, 36, on August 1st, 2015, and this was in Battleground, Washington. But it was actually in the newspaper. It was reported in a newspaper called The Columbian, which is a newspaper in Vancouver, Washington. And they actually mentioned gang stalking in the article because the person claimed that the person he killed had been stalking him. And also there was a case which you can look up. This just happened a few days ago. If you look at the freethoughtproject.com, there's a guy named an activist who's this anti-police brutality activist named John Lang, and he went on Facebook and wrote a message on January 14th saying that if he ended up dead, it was because of the Fresno Police Department, and then he was found stabbed to death inside of his home only a few days after predicting that he'd be killed by the police. And also his house was set on fire, too. Wow. And that's something you may want to look into, John Lang. That's sort of like an unfolding story. Right.
And that's another thing I was going to ask you about. The local law enforcement, what were they thinking about this? They obviously were connected into the case of what was going on with Damien, right?
It's really interesting. There was one point where, if you think someone early on, if you think someone's outside your house stalking you, your impulse is to call the police, right? Damien would not normally do that because he didn't usually have good relationships with the police, going all the way back to his dad, who, as I said, was a narcotics officer. But in this case, he broke down and called the cops because he was genuinely concerned about who the hell are these people. 2 cops show up. There was a young guy and an older cop. And Damien got the distinct sense that the older cop kind of knew exactly what was going on, was being very dismissive. The younger cop seemed concerned. Now, it could be this is like a good cop, bad cop routine or something, but it seemed from Damien's perspective that the young cop was actually asking him questions and genuinely wanted to help him. What did they look like? Maybe we should write this down. And the other cop was like, don't bother, write it down. He was just completely dismissive of it. And he got the sense that the one cop, the older cop, knew exactly everything that was going on and why this was happening to Damien. And the younger cop had absolutely no idea. And so I wonder to what extent, how many law enforcement officials are aware of this. Because there are some cops who do not take kindly to vigilantes. And some of these people you could describe them as vigilantes, because it's kind of like back during Watergate, you had plausible deniability. That's evolved or devolved into total deniability. So they can, for example, when I talked to Lita Johnson and I said, "Are you following my friend?" and she said, "Oh, no one in my agency is currently following your friend." That's a truthful statement. That's total deniability, because that's probably true. No one in her agency is doing that, because I recently I know a guy who he's a constitutional lawyer whose name you would know if I mentioned it, but I'm not going to mention it. But he's aware of a case in New England, the Clamshell Alliance. Do you know who the Clamshell Alliance are? They're an anti-nuclear activist group, and they were protesting this particular power plant in New England, and they were being stalked and harassed. So they actually tried to sue the power plant for hiring these people to harass them, and this went into court. And the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, managed to get the case thrown out. Flash forward a few months later, the prosecuting attorney who was working for the Clamshell Alliance was at the local gym, and he saw the defense attorney, on the treadmill. So he went up to the attorney and he said, "Hey, that they were actually being harassed, right?" And the lawyer was like, "Oh yeah, I know that," just casually, as he's toweling off. And he goes, "Oh yeah, I know that." He goes, "But it wasn't like some COINTELPRO thing." He goes, "It's just a bunch of vigilantes." He goes, "I know, I've got their newsletters." And he goes, "You want to see him?" Just casually, "You want to see him?" So he takes him back to his office, and he has all these newsletters from this group that calls itself the LEIU, Law Enforcement Intelligence Unit, which actually has been around for years. It goes back to the 50s. It grew out of the anti-communist McCarthy era, and it's still around. And basically, it's ex-law enforcement, ex-military people. And essentially, because they're ex-law enforcement, ex-military, and they go around fouling people, harassing people, stalking people, they can genuinely say, "No one in our agency, no law enforcement agency is doing this." So that's where the total deniability aspect comes into it.
Wow, that's frustrating. There's no doubt about that. Well, you'll be interested when you see my documentary. It's I had to testify in the courts on that one. So, and I do know how that works. And we did talk about the scripting off air, and I'll tell you point blank, they do a lot of scripts insofar as the way they communicate. And sometimes they leak it out and they break, like you say, they break off script to a point where they're communicating the truth. And that happened to me with my handler several times over. So, yeah.
Where your handler decided to actually approach you and talk to you?
Oh, yeah. He met with me in person several times, and he actually communicated the technology we were talking about, the technology with the artificial telepathy. He admitted it, and then he lied under oath. He committed, complete perjury. He lied under oath right in front of the judge, but the whole thing was set up before I even walked into the room. Before I even went into that, to testify, it was already set up. And it was his suggestion that I talk to the magistrate, by the way. But it's a really strange case, and I'll tell you what, I had an ex-NSA lawyer, federal lawyer, shadowing that case. So it got real ugly and it got real weird.
I can't wait to watch it. I'll share it with Damien.
Yeah, he'll probably be laughing in a weird way because he can laugh now, but at the same time, it's really not appropriate. And honestly, this is it's so illegal. What they're doing is so not right, and it does need to be addressed. There's no doubt.
It's absolutely. It's the there's a dark kind of absurdity to it.
There's a lot of abuse to it too. I went through an abusive program. I don't know if his was as abusive as mine was, but mine was pretty torturous. It was really bad. So, it's a miracle I got out normal. Seriously.
Oh no, that is incredible, and it's a testament to the human spirit that people do
absolutely
manage to actually deal with it.
And I think that spirit, that's when our higher consciousness comes in, because that's what kept me going, was my martial arts background and my spiritual background. So.
There's a quote from former FBI Assistant Director Thomas Fuentes, and you can probably find this if you just Google it. But I find this quote interesting. This is what the former FBI Assistant Director said. He said, quote, "If you are submitting budget proposals for a law enforcement agency, for an intelligence agency, you're not going to submit the proposal that we won the war on terror and everything's great, because the first thing that's going to happen is your budget's going to be cut in half. You know, it's my opposite of Jesse Jackson's Keep Hope Alive. It's keep fear alive. Keep it alive." And when I read that, the keep fear alive, I mean, that's the main objective. That's the main tool, fear, and keeping fear alive is the main thing that they want to do.
Right. Well, what concerns me the most is that with everything that's going on the timeline right now, where there's so much deception happening and so many control mechanisms, I think this is another maneuver to push and corral people who are standing up and being counted, defending the Constitution. I can see this thing going bad really quick, and insofar as mass groups of people getting psychotronically gaslighted, gang-stalked, and harassed with all sorts of different technological weapons, because, I mean, they're not honoring anybody's free will at this point in the continuum, but I'm saying if people start to stand up more and more, I think you're going to see a counterattack with this technology.
Oh, yeah. In fact, oh God, there's a million, a million different tangents going on in my mind at the same time. You know what I mean?
Right. No, I understand. But yeah, we're in for a really strange ride, if you ask me, for this next year or so. So.
Oh, absolutely. Anyone who's listening, and there's a site I'd like to mention called fightgangstalking.com, and if you go there, and on the left side of the screen there's a little section called Tactics for Fighting Back, and it's an interesting little essay about just kind of simple everyday things that you can do to kind of push back. And it's just if anyone's listening and dealing with this, it's an interesting thing to read. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
I certainly appreciate that. Well, I do a lot of investigations, and I work with different groups, and I can tell you there are a lot of people out there who are targeted. A lot of people in Germany right now getting hit really hard too, by the way, globally, with different types of psychotronic harassment, gaslighting, and gang stalking. So it's huge, and it's almost becoming, in my opinion, an epidemic, although you'll never hear it on mainstream.
Well, of course. Why do you think Germany in particular?
I'm not quite certain, but take a good look at what's happening over there with all the upheaval and you call it immigration, you call it an invasion, but there's a lot happening there, and they're falling apart. These people are Germans that are getting hit, the ones that have been in contact with me. So they're, it's just, I'm not sure why. They seem like they're, nice people, but who knows? But I think it's all about control and manipulation, possibly testing exotic technology once again. So, but yeah, it's there, and if you really look, and roll your sleeves up, you'll see it, and I know you have. So, but you know what? We're getting ready to wrap this up pretty soon, and gosh, I could talk to you for hours and hours, Robert. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you on tonight.
Oh, it's been fascinating.
Yeah, it's been great. I hope to have you back again, and yeah, tell Damien he can reach out to me anytime. I understand exactly what he's. Well, not everything, but I do understand where he's coming from on many levels. And I do want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. I hope you appreciate the information. Stay tuned for Shiny Set Out with David Dunger and Becky coming up next to Sailing On to the Night from Down Under, as they always do with their great show. And once again, let's give everybody a rundown on how to reach out to you, get in touch with you, and how to purchase your books.
Well, you can buy Chameleo from orbooks.com. It's also available on amazon.com. My site is Crypto-scatology.com, CryptoScatology.com. And I have a series of articles I'm publishing now called A World of Stalking Fools, Part 1 through 5. And so far I've posted 4 parts to that. And the 5th part will be posted in a few days. And basically it gives information that's not in Chameleo. But it's, it's, as you know, it's an unfolding story.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to read more articles. Well, I was going to say, there is a way for him to get an implant analysis scan to see if he has signal anomalies, Damien, and I can give you more information on that. But there is, yeah,
absolutely.
Okay.
I would like to get him in contact with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I was going to mention real quick. We'll probably run out of time here, but when you're talking about Philip K. Dick, because he's one of my favorite authors, and he was psychotronically harassed for years. I know he was gaslighted and gang stalked too. But do you remember A Scanner Darkly? Because I like to mention that one. I don't know if you saw the animation.
Oddly enough, I use A Scanner Darkly a lot in my English classes at CSU Long Beach.
Oh, excellent. So do you remember the scramble suit, though?
Absolutely.
There was
one point. There was one. The scramble suit is almost exactly like the invisibility suit. And at one point, I remember Damien telling me, "Gee, I wish Phil Dick had written happy novels because it seems like they're taking all of his novels and manifesting them in reality." And when I said that to Tessa Dick, she laughed.
That's funny. But it's so true. Oh, I'm so glad you got to communicate with her. How wonderful is that?
Oh, it was fascinating. I think those interviews are available online. I can send you the link so you can hear them. But it's fascinating. At a certain point, I start interviewing her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What an incredible ride that was, and he's one of my favorites, like I said. But he was so ahead of everything. He saw it all coming. He really did. But I think he was interconnected to such an extent.
Oh, absolutely. And Tessa Dick was very much involved with his life and when he was writing A Scanner Darkly.
That's interesting. Wow. And of course, then there's the classic Blade Runner too, which of course, now they're talking about transhumanism, but that's all about interface with machines and upgrades. So with the artificial telepathy.
Or Minority Report, where they, predict crimes before you even commit them.
Exactly. It is kind of a shame that they're going in the dark realms with it instead of using it for more of a positive. It seems like everybody's guilty until proven innocent at this point in the continuum.
Absolutely, and I also get a sense that there's a real kind of Old Testament sort of self-righteousness about all of this. It's all about judgment.
Right. Yeah.
It seems, based on some of the comments that he got from Lita Johnson and others that I've heard, that there's a real religious component to this, by which I mean an Old Testament style kind of religious component.
That's interesting. Well, Robert, we're out of time. It's been a pleasure. Once again, I want to thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Have a great week, everyone.